The following program is a special presentation of the Big Ten Network, produced in association with the University of Wisconsin.
Director of the White House National Economic Council, Lawrence Summers, said recently this may not be a summer to remember, as he expects the U.S. economy to slide and unemployment to rise. Is he on target? Are there any bright spots? We'll talk to two experts about the current state of our economy next, during office hours. Hi, I'm Ken Goldstein, Professor of Political Science at UW-Madison. Today, during office hours, we'll examine the state of the economy with UW Real Estate and Urban Economics Professor Stephen Malpezzi and Economics Professor Karl Scholz. Prior to coming to Madison, Malpezzi was an economist at the World Bank and research associate at the Urban Institute. He is currently the director of the American Real Estate and Urban Economics Association. Scholz previously was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Tax Analysis under President Clinton and has published many articles on tax policy. Stephen, Karl, welcome. Thank you for joining us in Office Hours.
Great to be here, Ken.
Thanks for having us.
In our very first edition of Office Hours, we had your colleague Morris Davis and Mike Knetter, Dean of the Wisconsin Business School here. And Mike said that the economy was pretty much shadowing the Wisconsin weather, getting worse over the fall, and we did our taping in January, and I think it was well below zero, and things did not look that great. Well, it's a beautiful day today. Lake Mendota has thawed. There are people sunning themselves on Bascom Hill here. What's the state of the economy? Is it still tracking the Wisconsin weather, or are we still mired in an economic winter?
Things are tough out there. We're seeing some green shoots, and so the weather metaphor can be pushed a little bit, but unemployment is still rising. We expect that to rise for a while longer. Economic output, so GDP growth, is still pretty abysmal, and so we're in a very, very fragile state. The government has spent a lot of money on fiscal stimulus to try to get the economy moving more quickly, but we need to look at a few things. We need to look at credit markets. Is capital being allocated to useful purposes? We need to look at international markets. How are the economies in other countries doing? So are we able to export? Is there still demand for U.S. products? And lastly, we need to look at housing markets.
Good segue for you on housing markets. What's your read on the economy and what's your read on the housing market now?
I would start by agreeing with virtually everything Karl just said, and I would add a couple things. The thing I'm closely tracking right now are a couple of indicators of the housing market, including housing prices, which are still falling, but recently the rate of fall has begun to slow.
Let me interrupt you for
Sure.
a second there. So there was some news coverage of that.
Sure.
Still going down, but we got excited because it wasn't going down quite as dramatically.
House prices have to fall. They have to fall to a sustainable level before the economy can turn around, because basically from about 2000 to 2006, they went up much faster than ever could have been sustainable. Herb Stein, a famous economist who's also known for being Ben Stein's father, used to say, when something can't go on forever, it will stop. And that passes for a joke among economists. But the key is,
it's a low bar.
Right, exactly. But the key is, house prices were rising from 5 to 7% faster every year than the rest of the economy during that 2000-2006 period. That simply could not continue. And we knew that there had to be a correction. We didn't know when. We don't know exactly how far down we have to go for the correction. Most of the rough indicators we look at suggest it's plausible we may be getting through it. And if the housing market begins to solidify by the summer, then I think we could see a turnaround in the rest of the economy perhaps early next year.
Well, let me have you comment.
That's the optimistic scenario, by the way.
Let me have you comment on a couple numbers here, because some data that just came out today, it's really stunning. So real estate prices in Phoenix down by over half, in Las Vegas close to half, in Miami 45%, in Los Angeles and San Diego a 40% decline in real estate prices. And there's still some downward pressure in those places?
Apparently, but again, our hope is, as you begin to think about how they relate to fundamentals. Fundamentals include things like people's incomes, interest rates, of course, what you can do, how you can do as a renter in the other major part of the housing market. Again, we don't know for sure. I think what scares some of us housing prices clearly overshot going up. What we don't want to see is house prices overshooting going down, past where they need to be at the fundamentals. No one knows exactly where they should be. That's not something that's really knowable. But by most indicators I look at, we're getting there. The big concern I have is if we don't have some change in psychology, if some of the policy initiatives that we'll talk about later, I'm sure, don't take hold correctly, we may overshoot in the wrong direction and basically suffer unnecessarily.
Okay. So Carl, Steve's paying attention to numbers in the housing sector. And you spoke a little bit about the things that you were paying attention to, but for those of us following the scorecard of all the economic indicators that are out there, what's the numbers you're paying attention to? What are some of the tells that you're looking at in terms of how the economy is going to perform down the line?
Some indicators are going to work are going to be earlier signs of the economy getting out of the slump than others. And so, for instance, employment numbers or unemployment numbers, which a lot of people will focus on, will be a lagging indicator of how things are going. So even if the economy starts pulling out and goes from green shoots to actually budding plants, unemployment rates are likely to continue to go up for a fairly long period of time. The earlier indicators are going to be things like durable goods orders. That's showing signs that companies are starting to get orders or selling kinds of things. The other things would be inventories. And so right now we're seeing a huge piling up of inventories. When those inventories start getting worked off, that's going to be a sign that things are moving more rapidly. And then employment will follow. Employment, again, being a lagging indicator.
Okay. We're gonna jump to break now, and then we're going to come back and see if we can look in the crystal ball about how far down the line things are going to go before we do see improvement. Please join us as we continue our discussion about the current state of the economy and what we're likely to see down the line on Office Hours.
This program is a production of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. If you have comments about this broadcast, please email them to programming@uc.wisc.edu.
For more than 100 years, the University of Wisconsin has been inspired by the Wisconsin idea,
which says the good work of the university extends to the boundaries of the state and beyond.
So the UW works hard to help build Wisconsin's economy.
Educate people of all ages.
Advance health and medicine.
And enhance the quality of life for all of us.
Hit it!
The University of Wisconsin-Madison. Forward thinking.
Welcome back to Office Hours. We're with Karl Scholz and Stephen Malpezzi speaking about the current economic situation. Karl, Winston Churchill said after the summer of the Battle of Britain that it was not the beginning of the end, but it was the end of the beginning. Do we know whether we're at the end of the beginning of the end of this economic crisis?
We don't know. What's so unusual about the current economic meltdown is the synchronicity of all of the events. It's most of the time, if the stock market is doing poorly, housing markets are doing all right, or even if both are down, the rest of the world is doing all right. So there's always some spot where there's some reason for economic optimism. And what's so unusual about the events now is that every sector, across the board, across the world, things are in tough shape. And Steve talked about how the housing market crash precipitated a lot of this, but it's had contagion, if you will, into other financial markets. And the problem, or a major problem right now, is credit. That in times like this, financial institutions, particularly with weak balance sheets, are unwilling to provide credit. And a lot of the efforts of the Federal Reserve and the administration and economic policy making now has been to get these flows of credit moving again. We've been somewhat successful doing that, but whether it takes hold or not, and that is if we're at the beginning of the end, it must be the case that the assets that are on banks' balance sheets rebound a bit so that banks and other financial institutions are in strong fiscal health so that they can then make credit available so that the entrepreneurs who have good ideas business people who want to hire new workers are able to do so.
So Karl described this perfect storm, and I used a World War II statement, but we really are in the worst situation since World War II, since the Great Depression.
I agree. I think Karl's very much on the mark. I'm particularly concerned. I've been on sabbatical for part of the semester, so I've been doing some traveling to China, to Australia, and last year to India. Every place I go, people want to know about why this is happening and how it's happening, because it's affecting them directly. And this is the first year since World War II, according to most forecasts I've seen, that we're going to see a global decline in global output across the board. There'll be a few countries here and there who may not take a dip, but overall world output is going to fall for the first time since 1945.
I gave some numbers about declines in real estate prices in places like Phoenix and Las Vegas and in South Florida. Have we seen that? You're in the real estate economics business.
As far as the data tell us, we've never seen anything like this. That doesn't mean that, in the panic of 1907 that we didn't have, who knows what the decline in house prices was then. Every recession is different, every business cycle is different. But the reason I think housing is one of the key indicators to tell us when we're going to start out is that housing was the thing that led us into this time. And that, as Karl put well, there was contagion into a whole range of other markets. But the starting point was, first the subprime market went down the tubes, and as house prices fell, people with regular so-called prime mortgages began to face lower housing prices. They were underwater. They began to default. Now things are feeding on itself. The unemployment that, as Karl said, is a lagging indicator overall. As unemployment begins to mount, again, you begin to have people who made, on the face of it, good housing decisions having trouble make their mortgages. And that's putting continued pressure on prices.
Okay. We have a couple seconds left in this segment. Let me go to Karl. So real estate got us into this problem, but also drove the economy. Internet bubble in the late 90s. We're going to need something else, an economic driver, to get all those numbers you talked about up. What's on the horizon, or is that the big mystery?
It's not clear, and that's part of the big mystery. It's not clear whether there'll be export-led growth. It's not clear whether there'll be a rebound in the housing markets or technology or something that we haven't yet discovered. And that's the great uncertainty right now, because if you look, at least as I look out on the horizon, I don't see what will bring us out of the current malaise.
Okay. When we come back on Office Hours, we're going to continue with our discussion of the economy and talk about President Barack Obama's policies trying to get the economy back on track. Stay with us.
Consider this. There's a public university that consistently ranks among the top in the number of Peace Corps volunteers and in the number of graduates serving as CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, whether they are leading corporations or changing the world. The next time you see people doing extraordinary things, they are probably Badgers. The University of Wisconsin-Madison. Forward thinking.
Welcome back to Office Hours. We're discussing the current economic situation with Professor Karl Scholz and Professor Steve Malpezzi, economist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So we're discussing the current situation, what caused the current situation. That's basically what President Barack Obama stepped into. Stimulus plan, a bunch of other policies, and not unpredictably, he's getting criticism. Let's look at a little bit of that criticism. So Princeton economist Paul Krugman and New York Times op-ed writer writes, "It's as if the president were determined to confirm the growing perception that he and his economic team are out of touch, that their economic vision is clouded by excessively close ties to Wall Street." From the other side, Representative Paul Ryan, representative from not very far from Madison, south of Madison in Wisconsin, and part of the Republican leadership. "What we cannot do is borrow and spend our way into prosperity, building up huge federal deficits and calling it stimulus." Ryan's also had other comments when he's worried about that we're sort of falling into socialism with Obama. So, Krugman, we're not spending enough. Ryan, we're spending too much. Karl, you've been involved in a little bit of politics, aside from being an economist. Make some sense of that to me.
Well, this is a sure sign that we're in a difficult situation. There's no blueprint. And so the Obama administration is dealing with a crisis unlike any we've seen since the Great Depression, and so they're feeling their way. What Paul Krugman is worried about is we have all of these financial institutions that are essentially bankrupt, and so we could call them zombie banks. And what zombie banks are going to do, if they know the federal government is going to save them, is that they're going to make wild, reckless decisions to try to sort of gamble for resurrection, if you will. And Paul Krugman's convinced that that's the situation that we're in, and the government needs to quickly nationalize these financial institutions so the rogue zombie institutions don't go and cost the taxpayer a great deal of money. Congressman Ryan's coming at it from a different vantage point. It's not clear whether he downplays the significance of the current financial dislocation, but he instinctively is not crazy about the government spending a great deal of money to prime the pump of the economy. The fact that they're getting incoming fire from both the right and the left, it's a bit cliched to say so, but suggests to me that the administration is charting a sensible course. But reasonable people, as Congressman Ryan or Paul Krugman indicate, might disagree.
So maybe charting a sensible course, but as Karl says, Krugman and Ryan are serious people, and they're not voicing trivial concerns, right?
Each has a point, even though they're on opposite sides of the spectrum. You know, again, in today's crisis, if you're not confused, you're simply not thinking clearly yet. And really, no one knows the answer to these problems. You know, as Karl was saying, we basically have two fundamental problems at work with these institutions, with our financial institutions. We have a liquidity problem. We have a solvency problem. How we divide up the direction we go depends on whether you think the liquidity problem is most important or the solvency problem is most important. A lot of people think they know, but my judgment is we really don't know. And so we're doing some learning by doing right now. And so people are going to take a lot of shots. And I have a lot of problem with Professor Krugman's suggestion that we nationalize the banks, but we may end up doing that. You know, we may have to. And on the other hand, I recognize his problem about the incentive problems. But again, to solve a problem that has deep roots in financial markets, you need people who understand financial markets, most of whom work in financial markets. So that conflict is built in.
Okay. We're gonna come back, continue this discussion, and look a little bit farther down the line about what this spending might create in the future years. So please stay with us. Last segment of Office Hours.
This program is a production of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. If you have comments about this broadcast, please email them to programming@uc.wisc.edu.
Welcome back to Office Hours. Professors Karl Scholz, Professor Stephen Malpezzi, economist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So we have a chart up for our viewers to see which shows the yearly national deficit, with the line being the deficit currently and then projections going out to 2016. Karl, two questions. What are the implications of such large deficits down the line? Needs to be some spending now. And talk about, there's going to need to be some cuts in spending, but there's also going to need to be some differences in tax policy.
The greatest long-run threat that we face right now is, with the enormous fiscal expansion, is being on an unsustainable fiscal course. Because if the United States, if the deficit and debt are too large, that's going to put upward pressure on interest rates, making it harder for firms to acquire the capital needed to invest and grow the economy. And so As you mentioned, Ken, it's so important right now that we did have the fiscal stimulus, and we have an enormous deficit right now. But in the long run, there's a fundamental imbalance between the amount we're spending in the country and the amount of taxes we're raising. Right now, taxes as a share of GDP is 15.5%, which is the lowest level it's been since 1950. Spending as a fraction of GDP is into the mid-20s, and that accounts for such a large deficit. But going forward, the gap is still 3 or 4 percentage points.
So you don't have to run for re-election. President Obama has said that he's only going to raise taxes for people making over $250,000 a year. Is there enough money people making over $250,000 a year?
Very, very difficult given the other fiscal priorities that he has, in particular with national health insurance and for infrastructure investment and to invest more in human capital. I think it's a very, very hard problem.
Okay. Steve, so Karl said it's these deficits going down the line crowd out investment. They crowd out investment in housing too, and you've made lots of strong arguments about how the housing market's going to drive the economy.
These are big potential problems, and I'd just like to expand for a second on a point Karl made. You know, we've talked a lot during this half hour about things that have been happening that have been bad, but there have been a few things that have been surprisingly good. The dollar hasn't done too badly. The U.S. has continued to attract a fair amount of investment from overseas, given all the problems that we've had. And interest rates, particularly long-term rates, people forget the Fed does not control long-term rates, the market does. And long-term rates, including mortgage rates, have been very low. We have the lowest mortgage rates since the 50s or the 60s. And if the deficits turn that around where we begin to see a flight from U.S. capital markets by foreign investors, rising long-term rates, again, that could be a real negative thing. So again, we've had some positives. I feel like we're on a knife edge here, and it's a really tricky problem to navigate.
Expand that knife edge a little bit. What are the sides of the knife?
Well, if we don't do anything and the economy falls into a deep recession and really doesn't pick up growth 2, 3, 4, 5 years out, which I don't think will happen, but if we were to do that, that has negative budgetary implications too.
Yeah, you hit the Japan's lost decades.
Exactly.
So to speak. You could have a full decade with no growth, with no employment growth, dismal prospects for young people entering the labor market, a really bad situation.
So there's a rock and a hard place, and we're between them.
Excellent. Steve, Karl, thank you very much for joining us. I bet we're talking again in the fall, where after the summer weather in Wisconsin, and we'll come back
and the housing market turnaround.
And hopefully a housing market turnaround. We'll come back and check in with you about the state of the economy. Thank you very much for joining us today on Office Hours. That's all we have time for today on Office Hours. Just a quick reminder to watch all of our shows and get more information on any of the topics covered this season. Please go to officehours.polysci.wisc.edu. Thanks for joining us.
The preceding program was produced by the University of Wisconsin in association with the Big Ten Network.